Nighttime falls, and now the fun begins. Time for another story from Holly Whizzle.
So this happened a while back when I was in my early 20s. I was working at a little retail store in my town's mall. It was coming up to the end half of the day, and I don't know how I noticed it, but an older man, probably 50s, I'm not sure, had walked past my store about 3 to 4 times. Not consecutively, just every now and again. Now, I worked at one of those little costume jewelry stores, so it was odd for an older man to be walking past so many times, but I kinda didn't think anything of it. I don't even know how I picked up on it in the first place. It came closing time, and I had left to catch my bus home at about 6:30. I remember it was transitioning into winter because it was dark out by then. I'm a very paranoid person. I still live by the stranger danger rules. So even now, when I leave work, I make sure I change into an outfit less fashionable. I don't like drawing attention to myself in any way possible, so I try to make sure I'm as covered up and as average looking as I can be. I don't know why, but I have that disease where I attract all the wrong attention for no reason at all. So as I said, I was waiting for my bus home, sitting by myself at the town center's bus terminal, and guess who walks past? The older man. At this point, I kind of felt a little uneasy, but in my head, I tried to make reason prevail, as many people take buses all the damn time. My bus showed up and I got on, and well, you can all guess who got on after me. I remember sitting in the seats facing inward, the ones for wheelchairs, and he sat at the first seat above the steps. I remember staring forward and feeling his eyes burning into me. I kept trying to use my peripheral vision to see if he was looking at me, but not wanting him to know I noticed him. The whole bus ride, I waited to see if he got off before my stop, thinking it was just my over-anxious paranoid mind working overtime, until I pressed the button for my stop. I waited until the least possible second to press it, and as I stood up, he did too. I went to walk to the front door of the bus, and he exited the rear. At that moment, as soon as he stepped off, I sat back down again. I had no idea where the bus went after my stop, but honestly, I didn't fucking care. I will never forget the look on his face as the bus drove off. I've never seen such hate and anger in some person's face than I did through that window. His face is burnt into my memory like a photograph. It still absolutely terrifies me to this day. I have no idea what would have happened to me if I got off that bus stop that night, but I'm glad my paranoia was so intense I didn't. So creepy older man following me home. Let's not meet. This started about a month ago, on weekends. To help better explain the story, I'll explain my house. The house is actually a rather large 2-story house, or was. It was split into 3 separate apartments, well before I ever even moved in. There are 2 down on the first floor and 1 upstairs. The apartment next door is occupied by one of my best friends, and the upstairs apartment is very recently empty. I've lived here for 6 years with a roommate, our 3 cats, and my dog. Her and I have never had any issues prior to this, but very recently, our dog started barking randomly at nothing during the night, or so we thought. He would look out a window very intently, then run to the front door barking the whole way. We actually thought he was just seeing a cat or a rabbit and brushed it off, just telling him to hush. One night my friend/neighbor came knocking and said he thought he had seen someone out on his porch. He said he had grabbed a cane and tried to follow them, but they jumped over the porch and ran off. Since then, we made sure to check every time my dog was seemingly barking at nothing during the night, and my neighbor had seen a figure suddenly bolt at least twice upon checking. We've called the cops, but they said there wasn't much they could do. They asked if there was anyone we could think of that could be messing with us, and while there were some neighbors we occasionally had to call the landlord on, there was no one we could think of that would do that. The issues we had never been more serious than them being a little loud at 3 a.m. on a drunken Friday night. So we continued to live our normal lives. My roommate works 3rd shift, while I and my neighbor work 2nd shift. although he had just recently switched to the shift from thirds himself. Nothing ever happened while I was at home alone, and I figured it was over. Recently, however, I got a girlfriend, and due to scheduling, we usually spend the night at her house in the middle of the week, as those are often when my days off occur. Meaning at night, there's no one at home except for my dog, as my roommate only has weekends off. Last week I was at my girlfriend's, and things weren't going well. We had a bit of a fight, so I was lying in bed mulling things over in my head, unable to sleep. As I'm lying there around 2 a.m., my phone buzzes. I check it to see a text from my roommate asking me to call her when I got the text. I figure she's on break at work and just bored, or wants to shoot the shit about Overwatch, since it had just came out and I hadn't gotten to play it yet, not having been home. I gave her a call and she says she's at home and thinks somebody had been in the house. I asked what makes her think that, and she says our friend/neighbor had gotten home late from his job around 1:30. He said he had been home watching random stuff on YouTube, laughing rather loudly since he thought he was literally the only person in the house. He said he thought he heard someone walking around, and at first thought it was me until he remembered I was at my girlfriend's. He wondered why my dog didn't bark until he realized I'd taken my dog with me since her kids wanted to meet him. He called my roommate to ask if she'd called off work, when he said he started hearing a scratchy meow outside his window. He walked outside to find our eldest cat outside, meowing to be allowed back in the house. Our cats never go outside normally, but had once before. So he scooped him up and went over to our apartment. The door that separates our apartments is normally locked since he comes over a lot, and put him down. He tells my roommate this, and she told her boss, who told her to come home. Roommate came home, and she said she found our front door unlocked, which she never leaves unlocked, and the door to our sunroom was shut. We never shut that door, since our cat's litter boxes are in there, and they wouldn't be able to get into them if we did. She's checking around and finds boxes moved out of our hall closet, and a bunch of my card games and board games scattered around. Not how we had left them. She said she then heard a meow, and found one of our cats shut in the bedroom. Every day before she leaves, she makes sure no cats are in there, since one has a bad habit of pissing on the bed if it's shut in there. Also, our bass guitar was knocked off the guitar stand and onto the floor. None of our cats weigh enough to knock over that thing, especially not our kitten, who was shut in there. So she gets freaked out and checks all the windows. One in the sunroom is open, so the cats can sit in it and get some air, but the screen is untouched. She said she went outside and found a trash can dragged up against our house under that window, as if somebody had stood on it to peep in. So best we can figure, whoever this person was sneaking around again, and when they didn't hear our dog, they broke in. They must have been in the middle of looking through stuff when they heard my neighbor laughing, panicked, and ran off. I'm not taking any of this lightly, and will be acquiring a gun, since I'm often here alone at night. So person who's been sneaking around outside my friend and I's window, and broke into my apartment, for your sake, let's not meet. In August, I moved into my first apartment. I graduated from university, was offered a job as a teacher, and was well on my way to figuring out this whole adult life. I moved in with a longtime friend, and neither of us had any complaints about our apartment complex. Our complex is very nice. It's not a wonderful part of town, but it's truly a diamond in the rough. The complex is well maintained, clean, and other members have been nothing but really friendly. To get into our complex, there are 2 gates. If you live at the apartments, you're given a remote that opens the gate of your choosing. But if you don't live at the complex, you have to go through a directory at the front to find the name of the resident you're looking for. Once you've found the resident's name, it appears as last name, first initial. It calls the resident's phone and gives the resident a few options. The resident can choose to talk to the person who has called them and decide to let them in by entering their key code into the dial pad on their cell phone, or they can hang up and the gates will not be opened. Overall, I think the system helped to save me from the situation I got myself into. One night in October, I was driving home from my fiance's house. It was late at night, probably close to 2 a.m. I had just gotten off the freeway and was about to enter my neighborhood when I stopped at a traffic light. I was in the left-hand turn lane, and there was another car on the right-hand turn lane, 2 lanes away from me. The light changed to a green arrow, and I proceeded to turn left, and the car, which had previously been in the right lane, maneuvered to follow me. I thought this was weird because of how many lanes they cut across, but I figured they were lost, so I tried not to think much of it. I continued driving down the road and was about to make a right-hand turn into my neighborhood, and was distressed to see the car turn in behind me. Still, I ignored my gut feeling and figured they lived in the neighborhood around my complex. I remember thinking that they were driving just a little bit too close, but again, I tried not to let my anxiety get the best of me. I do have anxiety, so I figured it was just my brain playing tricks on me. I remember reading stories on here that the best way to tell if someone is following you is by turning right multiple times to form a square of sorts. I talked myself out of this maneuver. I wish I hadn't. I sped up just a bit, clicked my gate open, and pulled into the complex. The car following me whipped in right behind me. Again, I convinced myself that this was normal. They probably lived in the complex too, right? The gate opens up on the opposite sides of the apartments, so you have to drive through the entire complex to get where my apartment is. I drove through quickly. I was prepared to exit the complex just in case the person was still following me. But when I looked at the straightaway behind me, I realized that there weren't any headlights anymore. I laughed at myself for being so nervous and pulled into my parking spot in front of my building. As I parked and prepared to get out of the car, I turned for one last look and realized that the car had been following me and reappeared with their headlights off, and they parked in an unreserved spot just a bit down from my own. I knew that I should have turned my car back on and drove away. I knew that there were so many other things I should have done, but in a moment of panic, I jumped out of my car and ran up the stairs and into my apartment. I double-locked the doors, grabbed a knife, and ran into my room to call my fiancé. I heard someone shouting outside, which is very unlikely in my complex. It's very quiet, but I refused to listen to what they were saying, as I told my fiancé what just happened. I suddenly heard more voices shouting, and then it was silent. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I remember not being able to stand because my knees were shaking so much, and I tried to stop myself from crying so I would be able to see if someone broke down my door. My fiancé made it to my apartment in record time with a baseball bat for me to help me ease my mind. He stayed that night and let me sleep with the lights on. I couldn't get the sound of screaming out of my head. It was obvious they were calling for someone, and I figured it must have been me. I assumed the other person screaming must have been another resident who was trying to make the other person be quiet during the earlier morning hours. I figured the whole situation was over until I woke up the next morning. When I walked downstairs to my car, I discovered that one of my tires had been viciously slashed to ribbons. I then realized that I had left some mail with my name on it in my car in my hurry to the exit the night before. I didn't think much of it until later. I got my tire fixed and tried to push that night out of my mind. A few days later, however, I started to receive calls from the directory in my front building to let someone in. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I answered and asked who was calling me. I was met with silence, so I hung up and didn't grant access to the complex. Again, I was called, and the same procedure was repeated. Again, no one answered. They called obsessively from the call box directory for days. I finally snapped into the phone for them to tell me who they were, and a man answered. He told me that he lived in the complex and needed to be let in because he lost his key. He told me that he lived in the apartment next to me. I knew the family who lived next to me. There was a woman with 4 children, but no man. And if he really did live there and lost his key, he would have been able to call himself to open the gate. I told him I didn't believe him and hung up, just as he started screaming at me to let him in. The calls continued. Finally, I had enough. I marched to the office the next day and asked them to take my number off the directory, The man was unable to call me now, and I felt at peace. I warned the office about the man who had damaged my car, and they increased security rounds in the complex for a few months. As anticlimactic as it is, that was the last contact I had with the weirdo, thankfully. I know how I handled the situation by not listening to my gut when it told me something was wrong, got me into trouble. I allowed someone to follow me and learn my name, and they were able to torment me for weeks before I finally took action. I'm just thankful to my fiance and the staff at my apartment for taking action to help me and stop that creep from being able to contact me. So creep who followed me, slashed my tire, and screamed at me to let him in, let's not meet. First off, need to say a couple things. English is not my first language, and I apologize if I make any mistakes regarding spelling and grammar. This is my first post on here. I thought long and hard, should I ever share this? So this started happening to me exactly a year ago. I was living in another city attending university, my freshman year, and my then roommates were moving out due to them finishing their education. I needed to start looking for a new place. I had found 2 apartments, one in the center of the city, and the other nearby to where I was located. Long story short, I moved into the other one, which was populated by 2 guys. One of them we'll call Matt. Matt had a great taste in music, had great friends, was like the best friend I ever met. One of those people with whom you want to hang out with your whole life. The other one, Norris, well, I never got along with him. Mostly for him being the kind of guy that liked to follow others around, like he had no backbone. Whatever Matt did, Norris did. It was like something he needed to do, or back up Matt. After a week of smoking weed, hanging out, just having fun, just having the best days of my life, another guy moved in, Dan. Dan had a dog with him, but his dog left soon because he destroyed some wooden door, and it was either him or the dog. Matt had a girlfriend, Tina, that practically lived with us, love and everything. Now, one day, Dan and I were sitting outside our little terrace eating and drinking coffee, usual morning routine, and Tina came out to sit with us. She had a large bruise mark on her shoulder, so we asked her how that happened. She said Matt hit her. We actually just brushed it off, thinking she was messing with us. A few days pass. It was Tuesday night. I was in my room doing a seminar for a subject, and I heard a loud bang, like a bomb that went off in my head. I got up from my chair nervously, went to investigate. On the other end of the hallway, I saw Matt's hand on Tina's throat and him saying some things to her in a very loud, rough voice. Matt had a glass door, and while this was happening, there was no more glass on the door. They argued, she cried, and they both went into the night. The very next day, Tina told me and Dan that Matt used her head to break the glass from the door. The most insane part about this is that they kissed and made up. They loved each other again, after a shitstorm like that. She even made us lunch as an apology. I honestly thought I was losing my mind. Of course, things didn't end there. It was Friday, 3 days after the incident. That day, I had planned to go to a Miles Kennedy concert in the other city. But due to university and having to take an exam that day, I put my priorities straight, sold the ticket, and went to take the exam. Later that day, Matt, Tina, and Norris were hanging out. Me and Dan stayed in, because Dan had no money, and I just felt like staying in. He was giggling the entire time, so I asked, was it weed? He replied that it was shrooms. So I decided to take some money and try them. We went to his friend's house, where I got my dose, hung out there for a little bit, and we returned to our home. We were having a blast. Like, I can't even describe the feeling. We were happy, and we didn't know what was coming next. At around 1 a.m., Matt bursted into the apartment and started packing some stuff. We assumed that he and Tina had another fight. He was yelling at us to turn down the music. He had a really psychotic look on his face. We went outside after him to see Tina, sitting on a short brick wall across our house in tears, with a bone coming out of her leg. and blood coming out of her mouth. So yeah, he broke her leg and knocked her tooth out. And that was all happening in the street while Norris was watching without doing shit to stop Matt on their way to the apartment. Me and Dan, we were out of our minds with what we had just witnessed. Being on shrooms and experiencing something so traumatic was insane. We contemplated calling the cops, but both Tina and Matt disagreed. Matt and Norris took Tina to a cab and into a hospital. There she lied and said she fell on some stairs. Me and Dan were outside the whole night, just trying to pull the pieces together. Dan told me that Matt did stuff like this before, to every girl he had. He was just very good at masking his wild side from everyone. Dan went home that morning, and I stayed alone in the nut house. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard a girl's voice, and I really thought I lost it by this point. When I woke up, Tina was again there. Her leg was taken care of in the hospital, and she had a cast on it. I talked with Matt about it, and he told me the most craziest thing I've ever heard, that some people express their love in that way. He being one of them. I talked with her for some time, trying to get her to leave and never come back, and to call the police. She packed her stuff and we went outside, waiting for her friends to come pick her up. Matt stormed outside with a big knife in his hand. I can't even express how crazy his eyes looked. He told us if we mentioned this to anyone, he'd come after us and he'd kill us. In that moment, I knew that the man I once met, the greatest friend in the world, was long gone, and I needed to get out of there as soon as possible. I left that day, called every number in my phone, left a lot of things there, but I didn't care. My life was on the line. I settled at a friend's home and lived there for a while. University was ending, exams were coming, and I went home to clear my head. When I returned, I had a conversation with Tina, and she told me she called the cops on him. He was then awaiting trial. I don't know what happened since I lost contact with Tina, and I really don't want to remind her of the horrible things he did to her. So Matt, let's not meet ever again.